most of you who are here, already understand Israel, the biblical place of Israel, and we'll overcap it a little bit. If it's new to you, God gave me a great analogy. I went to go talk about Israel to my old high school. I graduated from Faith Christian, and I had the opportunity to go teach Bible class for a day for 8th through 12th. And how do you explain Israel and the paradigm of Israel to young kids? And the Lord gave me a cool analogy. When we read the Word, it's a beautiful picture, and we see the painting. But if we don't understand Israel's place, we're just seeing a flat painting, and it's beautiful, or a movie, right? It's a beautiful movie, the Word of God. But when you put on the glasses that is the understanding of Israel's place and our place within Israel and the grafting in, the image pops out. It's like putting on 3D glasses. And I think this is going to add to that, today's message, hopefully. Let's start by going to Romans 11. Just to recap here. Romans 11, hopefully a verse that's familiar to most of us. So starting in chapter 9, Paul begins his defense of Israel and explains that God has not forgotten them, he has not divorced them. Paul says he is so grieved about the whole thing that he, if it were possible, would give up his salvation so that Israel as a whole would see Messiah. And then in chapter 11, he speaks to the Gentiles who've been grafted in. And we're just going to look at verse 11. In that case, I say, isn't it that they have stumbled with the result that they have permanently fallen away? Meaning Israel, heaven forbid. Quite the contrary. It is by means of their stumbling that the deliverance has come to the Gentiles in order to provoke them to jealousy. And there, in talking about provoking to jealousy, Paul is referencing Deuteronomy 32:21. We, as believers in Messiah Yeshua, are a fulfillment of prophecy. Moses had warned Israel. This microphone's getting away from me. Moses had warned Israel in Deuteronomy 31 that they would become corrupt and provoke the Lord, and so he would provoke them with a non-people, and that's us. But today we're going to look beyond Israel, and it's for our sake and for their sake as well, for Israel's sake. All the stuff we're going to go over, and any teacher that you ever hear, don't take my word for it. Acts 17:11, Paul makes note that the Bereans were more fair-minded than those in Thessalonica because they received the word with all readiness and searched the scriptures daily to find out where these things were so. And so don't ever take my word for it. Double check me. All right. For those of you who are also new to me, I use a slightly different Bible translation, so it's going to look a little differently. I use the Complete Jewish Bible. It was translated and edited by Dr. David Stern. And the reason I use it is, one, the Lord used it. This is how he prepped me before he sent me to Israel in refreshing the Jewishness of the gospel to me. And by reading this, particularly the New Testament, and putting Adonai instead of Lord and putting Yeshua instead of Jesus and all those things, it just reminds us that it is a Jewish Messiah that we have pledged allegiance to. Just a little bit of background. Dr. Stern, Los Angeles, accepted Yeshua late in life, went back to school with the express purpose that he was going to translate the New Testament. Actually, he was going to do a commentary first, but he found so many problems in the translations that he decided he was going to translate it from scratch. So he translated the New Testament from scratch into a Jewish-centric translation, and it's a great addition to your study. And this is what he says. He says, he did it because the greatest schism he saw in the world was the separation between the church and the Jewish people. And this is meant to challenge both sides to re-examine Jesus, for the Gentile to see his Jewishness, and for the Jew to see his Jewishness, and that he was for them all along. As a side note, there's an organization in Israel called Maoz Israel that is in the process of translating this commentary into Hebrew. If you're interested in supporting that project, talk to me and I'll tell you how. I think it's amazing that they're translating it into Hebrew. All right. And if it's new to you and you want to look at it before you buy, or instead of buying, Bible Gateway has recently added it to their library of Bibles. You can read it there in parallel with the NIV and King James and everything else. All right. Let's go to 2 Timothy 2. Second Timothy 2. I'll let you get there. I'm actually going to read that one in the NIV. All right. 2 Timothy 2, verse 15. Do your best to present yourself to God as one approved, a worker who does not need to be ashamed and who correctly handles the word of truth. Some of your translations will say divide, but today I like handle here. We need to handle the word correctly, and Paul was admonishing Timothy here as a pastor, but as intercessors, we need to be able to know how to handle the word, how to pray it back to God, how to understand what he's saying about particular things. Okay, let's jump all the way to the Old Testament, Exodus 4. This is just a warm-up. We're going to live in Genesis most of the night. Exodus 4, verse 22. So this is this is the Lord talking to Moses. And he tells him to tell Pharaoh, Adonai says, Israel is my firstborn son. And of course, this still holds. This is important that we understand this in our worldview and in our Christian view. Israel is my firstborn. And I know that the people here at JHOP understand this and they know how to defend it. But the Lord wants us to add some to this. Betty had actually asked me to talk about Israel in current events and explain some of the recent international votes, and I am going to do that next week. But the Lord said, no, I want you to talk about Ishmael first. God is not partial. The issue of Israel is of priority, not of partiality. And that's something that we need to learn to explain to people. Because a lot of people will say, oh, you just love Israel, and you always support Israel, and Israel can do no wrong in your eyes. And that's not true. We love Israel because God loves Israel. It is the apple of his eye. He says that you poke him in the eye if you offend Israel. And so that's why we love it. But we need to understand how God sees it. He's not being partial. Israel's just priority. One of the best examples I heard for this was a worship leader in Jerusalem. When he was first going to Jerusalem and the Lord was first laying Israel on his heart, among other things, he was grappling with this. He was like, well, what do I do? And he said he was at the Western Wall with his kids. And that God said to him, do you love all your kids? He said, yeah, of course I do. He goes, but Samuel is your firstborn. He has a special position. He goes, yes, my firstborn has a special position. And God said, that's how it is with Israel. I love all my kids, but Israel has a particular position. So it's priority, not partiality. And let's, you don't have to go to these verses. 1 Timothy 5:21. Keep these instructions without partiality and to do nothing out of favoritism. So this is Paul telling Timothy and the Lord telling us. Luke 20:21. Here the spies are coming to Jesus and they're coming to trip Jesus up, but they speak truth. It says, Teacher, we know that you speak and teach what is right and that you do not show partiality, but teach the way of God in accordance with the truth. So Jesus is not partial. And then Acts 10:34-35. Peter says, I now realize how true it is that God does not show favoritism, but accepts from every nation the one who fears him and does what is right. And so here Paul is talking as a Jew, saying God hasn't shown us favoritism. He accepts everyone, including the Gentiles. This is when he's with Cornelius. And so God is not partial, and he continuously shows us that in the scripture. So let's jump to Genesis 12. Genesis 12, a little dry, a verse also that we should all know. This is Abraham's calling out. Now Adonai said to Abram, get yourself out of your country, away from your kinsmen, and away from your father's house, and go to the land that I will show you. I will make you a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you are to be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you. I will curse anyone who curses you, and by you all the families of the earth will be blessed. So this is the first place that we take a lot of people to show why we're supposed to bless Israel. And we know that further down, Abraham gets Isaac, and we love Isaac because God loves Isaac. He's the son of promise. He's the picture of Messiah. He's born after a long wait. He's sacrificed, and in Abraham's mind, he's resurrected. But when you read the narrative, Abraham had so many more sons, and we cannot forget that. We cannot, especially with current events right now. We must love them too, and we must bless them. There are several, but we're just going to look at Ishmael as a representative of non-Isaac. All right. I'm going to challenge us tonight. I know that 9/11 is a very deep wound in the American psyche. And then all that was brought rushing back on Monday with the Boston Marathon bombing. And now that we know who these guys were and most likely what their motivation was. And then you add to this the biblical love of Israel and the fact that Islam hates Israel. Messiah said to love our enemies, which is a hard word. But I'm going to show tonight that Ishmael is not God's enemy, and that he too is a son of promise, and that God longs to reconcile with him. And we need to have that perspective, especially as things heat up here. I don't know that Boston's going to be the last time we see this kind of thing. It happens in the rest of the world all the time. There's a guy named, I don't have his name. I think his name is Raymond Ibrahim. He's a Coptic. What he does is he documents Muslim persecution of Christians, and he puts out a monthly report. And every month I read this report, and it's just like, I post it for intercessors, for those who pray for the persecuted church. This is just in February. Egypt destroyed a Coptic church because it was an unlawful member to Muslims who live in the adjacent area. Indonesia, 4 churches firebombed with Molotov cocktails. Libya, a Coptic Christian church in Benghazi was attacked. Zanzibar, arsonists sent fire to the evangelical church of Siloam. Cameroon, 2 Muslim converts to Christianity were shot dead, 2 others wounded. Most of us are probably following the story of Pastor Saeed Abedini in Iran, who's being beat in the Even prison. Kenya, 1 church leader was killed by an ambush by the Somali Islamic group, Al-Shabaab. And in Libya, Christians from all walks of life were arrested and some were tortured on the accusation that they had been evangelizing Muslims. And that's just half of this list for February. So this is a hard word. But it goes with that love the sinner, hate the sin thing. And it goes with understanding what God wants for Ishmael and where he's coming from. And I want you to know that the Lord has taken me through this process over several years. My first time in Israel in 2009, it was definitely my first week there. It might have been like my third day there. And I was just wandering through the old city, and I saw where I could get up on the rampart. You know, if you go to one side, you have to pay to get on the wall, to walk on the wall. But if you keep going far enough, it becomes free, and you can climb and walk on the wall of Old City Jerusalem. And it's great because you can see all the way into the Ginham Valley and then down into Kidron and see the Mount of Olives. And so I'm walking along the wall, and just when I make the turn as you're heading to the western wall and the Temple Mount, the Dome of the Rock just came up over around the wall and coming up over the Kotel there. And I got to tell you, I got so angry. I've been there for 3 days, and I see this thing, and my spirit knows it is not supposed to be there. And I got very, very angry. And the Lord had to calm me down and say, you know what? That's the way it is right now. And I know, and it's okay. It's under control. Just chill out. And then, a couple days later, maybe a week later, I went to City of David. City of David is just south of what we know as the Old City, and it is an archaeological dig site that they say is probably the remnants of David's palace. This is original Jerusalem. This is the Jerusalem that he conquered from the Jebusites. And that's where you go to Hezekiah's tunnel. Hezekiah's tunnel is what Hezekiah built for the siege to get water into the city, and it's amazing to walk through it. Thousands of years old in Bible history. You're walking through Bible history, and it's just so cool. So I paid to go into Hezekiah's tunnel, but I wasn't dressed for it. Once I got there, I realized it says the water will come up to here, probably to here on short people. So, and I was in jeans and boots, and I thought, no, I don't want to get everything wet. So as I went through everything, because you're actually going through an archaeological dig, and you get to read all the signs of this and that. But right before you get to Hezekiah's tunnel, it tells you, look, once you go through here, you got to go through water, and there's no way out. If you don't want to get wet, go this way. So I went that way. I have gone through the water since, and I recommend it. It's just awesome. But anyway, I came out what was called the Canaanite Tunnel. And so this is the City of David here. If you keep walking what is south towards that valley, along that hill, you come out of the Canaanite Tunnel right on that valley. And it was cool. And I was looking at all that. That's Arab village over there. And between where I was and that was a guard tower. And I was very grateful. I'm very grateful every time I see an Israeli soldier. You're very grateful for them. You feel safe. And so I was talking to the Lord and just checking everything out. And then the Muslim call to prayer started. And it's echoing through this valley. And what happened again? I got angry. I got angry and I started praying in tongues. Like warfare. And the Lord told me, stand down. And I said, what? And he said, stand down. He told me 3 times, stand down. And he says, this is the way it is. And it's okay. And I understand and I know it's under control. And I said, okay. And it took me a while to come down, but I was like, okay. And you got to get used to it. You hear it. You hear it 3, 4, 5 times a day, depending what part of the city you're in. You hear the call to prayer. For in the Lord's humor, or character building, as one of my coaches would say. And he used the 4 a.m. call to prayer to get me up every morning for about 2 weeks to pray for the Jews walking into the synagogue across the street. I would wake up and kind of just sit there by the window, and then about 30 minutes later, all the Orthodox Jews would start streaming into the synagogue for their morning prayers. Anyway, you get used to it. And we'll talk about the call to prayer a little more. So the Lord knows, and Jerusalem is under control, and he knows exactly what's happening there. Okay. Let's talk about Hagar. We know the story. Sarah has a lapse of faith and says, "Here, Abraham, take my slave girl. You can have the son of promise with her." And she gets pregnant. And Sarah gets jealous. And so begins the strife. And in the end, it will culminate with Ishmael being banished from his home. Let's go to Genesis 16. All right. We're going to read verse 7 through 13. The angel of Adonai. So I missed a little bit of background. Hagar, because Sarah's turned against her, has run away. And she's out crying in the desert. The angel of Adonai found her by a spring in the desert, the spring on the road to Shur, and said, "Hagar, Sarai's slave girl, where have you come from? Where are you going?" She answered, "I'm running away from my mistress Sarai." The angel of the Lord said to her, "Go back to your mistress and submit to her authority." The angel of Adonai said to her, "I will greatly increase your descendants. There will be so many that it will be impossible to count them." The angel of Adonai said to her, "Look, you are pregnant and you will give birth to a son. You are to call him Ishmael." God pays attention because Adonai has paid attention to your misery. He will be a wild donkey of a man with his hand against everyone and everyone's hand against him, living his life at odds with all his kinsmen. So she named Adonai, who had spoken with her, El Roi, God of seeing, because she said, "Have I really seen the one who sees me and stayed alive?" So Hagar's run away, and she's really despondent. And God shows up. It's the angel of the Lord. I really think it's a pre-incarnate visitation from Messiah because of the promises he makes, and because she says, "Have I really seen God and stayed alive?" And here we get the name for Ishmael. She names him God has heard. God has heard. And that will come up again later in the narrative. So when Ishmael is born, Abraham is still waiting for the son of promise. He knows it's not Ishmael. But then he basically asks God to make Ishmael the son of promise. Let's go to Genesis 17. Genesis 17, verse 18. So Abraham's still waiting, and so he goes to God and says, "If only Ishmael could live in your presence." And God answered, "No. But Sarah, your wife, will bear you a son, and you are to call him Yitzhak, Isaac. I will establish my covenant with him as an everlasting covenant for his descendants after him. But as for Ishmael, I have heard you. I have blessed him. I will make him fruitful and give him many descendants. He will father 12 princes, and I will make him a great nation." So Abraham goes to God to assure Ishmael's position, and God grants that in his mercy. He tells him, "I'm going to bless Ishmael. He's not the one. You have to keep waiting, but I will bless him." So we go a little further down the road. Isaac is finally born. And things get worse. We don't know how old Ishmael is at this point. Some people say he was as old as 12 years old. And he doesn't like his baby brother. And he starts picking on him. And Sarah, of course, is already bitter against Hagar. And so she's had it. She's had it. And she tells Abraham, get them out of here. I don't want anything to do with them. She actually says in verse 10, but I don't know what chapter. I think it's chapter 21. Throw out this slave girl and her son. I will not have this slave girl's son as your heir along with my son Yitzhak. And I love Abraham. Abraham says, I'll be right back. And he goes to pray about it. He goes to pray about it. Abraham is one of the great intercessors, of course. We know how he interceded for Sodom. So he knows he has the Lord's ear. So let's go to Genesis 21 for the answer. Verse 12. So he goes and says, God, Sarah is upset and she wants me to kick them out. But God said to Abraham, don't be distressed because of the boy and your slave girl. Listen to everything Sarah says to you, because it is your descendants through Yitzhak who will be counted. But I will also make a nation from the son of the slave girl, since he is descended from you. So again, God reiterates his promise to Ishmael here. And it's for Abraham's sake. God is sanctifying Abraham's lapse of faith and saying, okay, dude, you screwed up, but I'm going to take care of it. I didn't watch the Bible miniseries. I watched pieces. And I know there's strong feelings on both sides about it. But there was one portion I caught, and it really spoke to me. They showed, after Ishmael is born, Abraham with Ishmael, teaching him to be an archer. And I wonder if that's what it was like. Here's this little boy, and his dad is raising him up and teaching him how to survive out in the desert. And now he's going to get thrown out. And we have to understand Ishmael's wound here, because it's a deep one. I don't know. I know that a lot of people feel that they took a lot of liberties in that miniseries, but that scene really spoke to me. Because sometimes we read over this text and we go too fast and we don't look at what's really happening to the characters here. And so imagine, let's say that Ishmael was about 12, okay? And yeah, he's being mean to his little brother, and his stepmom is yelling at him. And suddenly she hears her say to his dad, get them out of here. I don't want to ever see them again. Imagine what a 12-year-old is thinking. Verse 14. So they leave, probably with a couple days worth of food, and says, you got to go. Sorry. So after leaving, Hagar wandered in the desert around Beersheba. And I don't know if you guys who have been to Israel or seen pictures of southern Israel, it is desert down in Beersheba to this day. Doesn't look very much different than out here once you get out of the city. When the water in the skin was gone, she left the child under a bush and went and sat down looking the other way, about a bowshot's distance from him. Because she said, I can't bear to watch my child die. So she sat there looking the other way, crying out and weeping. God heard the boy's voice. And the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, what's wrong with you, Hagar? Don't be afraid, because God has heard the voice of the boy in his presence, is in present situation. Get up, lift the boy up, hold him tightly in your hand, because I am going to make him a great nation. So again, God hears Ishmael crying in the desert. He hears Hagar crying in the desert. And he reiterates for the third time, I will make him a great nation. God set this in motion, and this is his blessing to Ishmael. And he made the promise to Hagar twice and then even to Abraham. Actually, he makes that promise 4 times. He makes it twice to Abraham and then twice to Hagar. God was with the boy, and he grew. He lived in the desert and became an archer. He lived in the Paran desert, and his mother chose a wife for him from the land of Egypt. And if you remember, Hagar is Egyptian, so she goes back to her home to go get him a wife. So he marries Egyptian, so he's really Egyptian. Here we go. This is where they're coming from, just geographically. All right, let's jump to Genesis 25 to see the 12 princes. Genesis 25, we're going to do verses 12 through 18. Here's the genealogy of Ishmael, Abraham's son, whom Hagar, the Egyptian woman, bore to Abraham. Listed in the order of their birth. Okay, bear with me here. These are tough names. The firstborn of Ishmael was Navayot, followed by Kedar, Adbeel, Mivsam, Mishma, Duma, Masa, Hadad, Tema, Utur, Naphish, and Kedma. And if they look different from yours, these are the transliterated Hebrew, is what they are. These are the sons of Ishmael, and these are their names, according to their settlements and camps, 12 tribal rulers. Ishmael's son lived between Havilah and Shur, near Egypt. As you go towards Asher, he settled near all his kinsmen. And so if you study out the sons, and also the sons of Keturah, because then Abraham had more sons with Keturah, all of them are associated with the Arabian Peninsula. We see at one point that they go east. Isaac, of course, gets the promised land, and all the sons of Abraham are told to go east, and they end up possessing the Arabian Peninsula. So we read earlier that Ishmael lived in the Paran desert. Okay, so this is the Arabian Peninsula, and it's got the modern countries laid on top of it. That's not going to show up. Okay, so Egypt's on this side right here. That's all right. We're good. And then we see Iran and Iraq all the way around. We see the little other countries that go around the peninsula. That's the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Kuwait, Oman, Yemen. And so right here, I looked it up today because I hadn't. The desert of Paran, they say, let me read my notes. Arabic and Islamic tradition hold that the wilderness of Paran is broadly speaking of the Tihama. And I was like, okay, what's the Tihama? The Tihama is the east coast of the Red Sea. Okay? So the desert of Paran is right here, this whole edge of the Red Sea. And if you notice what's in the middle of that wilderness, it's Mecca. According to tradition, this is Arabic and Muslim tradition, Ishmael settled in what is now Mecca. And also there's an Arabic translation of the Samaritan Pentateuch, and that's kind of convoluted. So an Arabic translation of the Samaritan version of the Torah has a footnote where it mentions Paran and says that it is Tilma. Okay? So there's a lot of evidence that says that it's that area. So we look again at verse 18, but in the NIV, his descendants settled in the area from Havilah to Shur near the eastern border of Egypt as you go towards Asher, and they lived in hostility towards all the tribes related to them. That's the NIV and also the King James. And isn't that the truth? I mean, they're fighting amongst themselves. Or just looking at what's happening in the Sinai alone, I think it's a fulfillment of Bible prophecy, but people wouldn't want to talk about that. Okay, so let's take a bit of a leap here. Let's talk about Muhammad very, very briefly. Muhammad was born in 570 in Mecca, which is in modern-day Saudi Arabia, but we saw that is right there in the desert of Paran. He united the tribes. Here, they were all against themselves unto this point. And he decided he was going to unite the tribes, and he used Islam to unite them. If you study that out, they were all polytheistic. And he chose one of the main gods in the pantheon and says, there's only one God, this is him, come here. And they did. They listened to his word. And if they didn't, he did some by force. Muslim tradition states that Muhammad descended from Ishmael. If you look up Kedar, one of the sons of Ishmael, he is the father of the Kedarites, a northern Arab tribe that controlled the area between the Persian Gulf and the Sinai Peninsula. That is a lot of ground. According to the tradition, he is the ancestor of the Quraysh tribe, and that is the tribe that Muhammad was from. So the Muslims are descendants of Ishmael, and if not physically, also spiritually. This heart wound turned into this distortion and has now propagated, and it is moving fast. It's still a very fast-growing religion. It's one of the fastest. They feel abandoned by the Father, and if you hear a lot of testimonies or read a lot of testimonies of Muslims, this is something they say, that they can't get to God, they feel abandoned, He's a master. And so a lot of them, the idea of a Father God really intrigues them because it goes against everything they were taught. Everything. And of course, they are in hostility with all around them. And we see that when we read these persecution lists, when we see the attacks on Israel, when we see the attacks even outside of Israel. Last year, they bombed a tourist bus in Bulgaria that they knew was full of Israelis. And it ended up being linked to Hezbollah. The hostility is sometimes violent. It frightens and angers us. Just like the Dome of the Rock and the Call of Prayer angered me the first time I encountered them in Jerusalem. And then one time in Sukkot Hallel, a pastor from Indonesia came to speak. He came to tell what wonderful things God is doing in Indonesia. If you don't know, Indonesia is the most populous Muslim country in the world. And yet, something very interesting is happening there. 10 years ago, they experienced some of the worst persecution ever. They were having churches bombed on Sundays or burned down with people in them. But out of that persecution grew a great revival, and the gospel is spreading in Indonesia. And just last year, the largest world prayer gathering was held in Indonesia, and I have friends from Jerusalem who were there. And I saw the video, and it's the stadium. It's a football stadium that holds 100,000 people. And it's full of Indonesian intercessors and other Asians. And another reported 2 to 3 million watched the webcast. I mean, it's just amazing. It's just amazing what's happening. And this is what this man said that really ministered to my heart. He said, consider the Muslim call to prayer as Ishmael crying in the wilderness. And I do now. Every time I hear it in Jerusalem, I stop and pray. Because they're lost in the desert. And they don't know what they're crying out to. But they're crying out, and God hears them. And that is the message here. He always heard Ishmael. He heard Hagar the first time she wandered into the desert. He heard Abraham when he went out to intercede on Ishmael's behalf. And he heard Hagar and Ishmael again when they were banished from the camp. What a wonderful name, Ishmael. God hears. God longs to reconcile the family. But the descendants of Ishmael must understand God's priority with Israel. It's not partiality. It's all for the sake of our redemption. The whole world is redeemed by a son of Isaac, the son of Israel, the son of Judah, Yeshua the Messiah. And we too have to understand this. Israel is the firstborn. Ishmael is not rejected. And Yeshua longs to reconcile with both. Ultimately, they're brothers. And even now, when you go to Israel and you read some news reports, I don't understand Hebrew like I'd like to. But I have heard a little bit this, or I'll hear translations. And they'll say, this is an example. It was Jerusalem Day, which is always, everybody's always a little tense on Jerusalem days because the Orthodox and some of the settlers come into town. It's the yeshiva kids. They come into town and they march through modern Jerusalem to old Jerusalem with flags. I wish I had one of those pictures right now. Chanting and singing. But what they do sometimes, unfortunately, is they go through the Arab quarter and harass people. And that's bad. But one time I heard and say, this is what they were telling the kids, don't antagonize the cousins. And they still call them that. Don't antagonize the cousins. Don't go knock stuff over in their shops or whatever it is. And actually, they always tell the Arab shopkeepers, you know what, you just don't want to open up today because the Jewish kids are going to pass through here and you don't want to be here. But they call them that. They still call them that. The cousins. And they are. They're cousins. Isaac and Ishmael are brothers. Here's another thing I heard from another intercessor that also ministered to me, because I really was I still am, gung-ho Israel. But it's hard. You get there and you're gung-ho Israel, and then you get mad about certain things, certain injustices, or certain things that you know shouldn't be the way they are. If you love Israel with a soulish love, you will hate their enemies. And if you love the Muslims with a soulish love, you will hate Israel. So we must love Israel and Ishmael with the love of Messiah. We cannot be partial. We love Israel. I know I do, and I know certain people in this room with all their hearts. I can't wait to get back. But we have to extend that love and the gospel to Ishmael. We have to. So let's talk a little bit about what the Lord is doing among this people group. Let's go to Isaiah 19. Because the Lord is already moving in miraculous ways, in ways that need to be broadcast more and more. So Isaiah 19 is a prophecy against Egypt. I actually believe we're in the midst of Isaiah 19, but that's another teaching for another day. I do believe there's a passage in there that says that they will get a cruel taskmaster, and I do believe the Muslim Brotherhood is that cruel taskmaster, or at least the beginnings of it. And as you go through the prophecy, it's going to get so bad in Egypt that they will cry out to the God of Israel, and it's amazing prophecy. And I've already met some believers from Egypt and what's going on there. But at the very end of the chapter, it broadens things. It stops talking just about Egypt. So verse 23. On that day that Egypt cries out and the Lord heals them, is the context of the verse before. There will be a highway from Egypt to Ashur. Ashur will come to Egypt, and Egypt to Ashur, and Egypt will worship with Ashur. On that day, Israel will be a third partner with Egypt and Ashur, a blessing here on the earth. And Adonai Tsevaot has blessed him. Blessed be Egypt, my people, Ashur, the work of my hands, and Israel, my heritage. Your translation will say Assyria, more than likely. And we're talking about the kingdom of Assyria, and that's the kingdom that preceded Nebuchadnezzar's Babylonian Empire. So this is the old map. We'll look at get a little bit of modern context in a little bit. The light green is the farthest reaches of the Assyrian Empire before it fell to Babylon. Okay, and then we have the Egyptian Empire, but at that point, the Egyptian kingdom was already part of Assyria. Egypt, probably at its height, came out a little further and went a little further south. So that is what the Assyrian Empire looked like when it conquered Israel. Now, here is that same pattern laid out on a modern map. So the Assyrian Empire in today's terms goes out as far as Iran, as far south as Saudi Arabia, halfway into Turkey, includes Cyprus, and of course about half of Egypt. So even though we've moved a bit from the Arabian Peninsula, the home of Ishmael and Muhammad and Islam, we know, just looking at this map, these areas are already dominated by Islam and beyond, right? Because if you keep going past Iran, you hit all the stands. And all of those are Islamic countries, or Islam is the predominant religion. And so just giving a breakdown, we look at Egypt. Right now it's being ruled by the Muslim Brotherhood with a huge influence from the Salafis. They're the really violent ones. We have Iraq, that ever since Saddam Hussein was taken down has been a civil war between the Sunnis and the Shias, and that continues. They're having their first vote, by the way, I think this weekend or early next week. We'll see how that goes. They've had bombings all this week. Iran is officially an Islamic republic, and it's Shia. Syria is about to fall to the Islamists, and with the help of the West, if you're following the news. I read this morning that we just promised another, I think it was $120 million worth of equipment, including armor and armored vehicles. Lebanon has a heavy Shia influence because of Hezbollah, and so is also influenced by Iran. Turkey is secular, but it's heavily Islamic, and Erdogan, I think, would like to see it made a Islamic state. Cyprus is interesting. Cyprus and Jordan are both interesting. Cyprus is actually divided. Half of it is Turkish and Islamic, and half of it is Greek Christian. So you need a passport to get to the other side of that little island. And then Jordan. The royal family, the Hashemites, descended from the same tribe as Muhammad. But Jordan intrigues me because in prophecy, if you read in Daniel 11, they are the only nation in the area that is not conquered by Antichrist. So I watch Jordan very carefully because I don't know how it's going to go down, but I find that very interesting. And if you see up to this point, they've managed to keep the Arab Spring fervor down at a midpoint as opposed to everybody else. So Jordan fascinates me. Okay, so let's read this verse again. We just went over all these countries, right? They're all Muslim. On that day, there will be a highway from Egypt to Assyria. Assyria will come down to Egypt, Egypt to Assyria, and Egypt will worship with Assyria. On that day, Israel will be a third partner with Egypt and Assyria, a blessing on the earth. For Adonai Tsevaot has blessed him. Blessed be Egypt, my people, Asher, the work of my hands, and Israel, my heritage. That's pretty radical prophecy in light of what's happening right now. But what I want to share with you now is we're already seeing first fruits of this prophecy. I've got photographic proof. I'm not going to show you too many photographs. One, because people tend to fall asleep during slideshows, and two, to protect some of the people who were at this conference, and I'm going to share with you. But first, if we look at this map, here we see the Assyrian Empire laid over again. This is a map made by that same intercessor I told you, the firstborn son story. His name is Steve Carpenter. He's a worship leader in Israel. And Isaiah 19 is really heavy on his heart. And what this map shows is the little fires are where there are already houses of prayer in the Middle East. This highway has begun already. There's a house of prayer in Baghdad, or a church. We'll talk a little bit about that. Already, a lot of the ancient churches of Turkey that we know from the 7 letters and from Paul's missionary journeys, those wells are being redug, and the Christians there are being energized. And they're being energized by strange groups, I think. I know one of the houses of prayer is run by a Korean couple. Another one is run by a Guatemalan couple. The Lord has just picked these people up from all over the world and says, go. And they're going and they're ministering there. Of course, Jerusalem, there's 4 major houses of prayer in Jerusalem and many other smaller ones. But those 4 major ones are all 24/7. There's a house of prayer in Cairo and in Alexandria, and I've met some of the people from Alexandria. And that girl, that house of prayer is run by a young lady, or one of the leaders there. And the Lord himself ministered Israel to her. She just sat down one day. She's a Coptic Egyptian, so grew up in the Coptic church, but the Coptic church teaches replacement theology. And because they don't want to make waves with their Muslim neighbors, they preach against Israel and all of that. And this girl sat down one day with the Bible, and God just took her through it and showed her that he still loves Israel and that she needs to love Israel. And she just took, she's about 24. She just took it and is amazing, passionate for the Lord. This photo is a little blurred out, just because we had to protect some of these identities. Last May, I had the privilege of being asked to document a conference in Jerusalem. It was held in Christchurch in the Old City. And Christchurch is an amazing place. It's the oldest Protestant church in all of the Middle East. It was established in 1849. It survived through all the wars in the area, unscathed. Beautiful, beautiful neo-Gothic building. And there was this conference, they called it At the Crossroads, and it was specifically an Isaiah 19 conference. And it was a miracle, because here we are in Jerusalem, and we had representatives from Egypt, from Lebanon, from Iraq, and from Turkey. And they all came, and some of those, it's amazing they got let into the country, because they shouldn't have. But through a lot of lobbying and relationship building, they were able to say, these are all Christians and they've come here to worship. Would you please let them in? And Israel let them in. In this photo, I wish we had Egyptian here, but we don't have an Egyptian. The thing about the Egyptians is a whole mess of them were supposed to come to the conference. And then something happened and they all freaked out. And they all said, sorry, we can't come. It's too dangerous. And the only Egyptians that came were 2 20-something women. All the men chickened out. And these 2 women came. The guy in the middle there is an Israeli Jew, very precious believer. The guy over there on the far side is from Turkey. And the guy on this side is a Palestinian who now ministers the gospel in Iraq. And they sneak Bibles in. And he told us a story of one of his friends who was shot in the head because he was found with Bibles and he survived. And we just heard these testimonies for 3 days. It was just amazing. So here we have almost the whole highway representative. We have Assyria and Assyria and Israel worshiping together. This guy, if you watch the video on YouTube, the photo won't be shown. But I'm showing it to you because he really touched me. His testimony just really touched me. And it was a miracle he got let into the country. This guy's a Kurd from Turkey. A Turkish Kurd. Turkish Kurd, there we go. And he fought for the PKK. If you guys know who the PKK is, that's the resistance group trying to break the Kurds off of Turkey. The Kurds, actually I'm going to go forward a little bit. the Kurds got stiffed. I read a little bit about this. They were supposed to get land after World War I when we divided the Middle East. And by we, I mean France, the UK, and Russia, with the U.S. watching on. And that's where we get the Palestinian Mandate and all that. Well, I saw today, I didn't know this. They were supposed to get a little chunk of land. The Kurds were. But something went wrong. I didn't read all the details, but basically they got attacked from all sides, and they didn't get their country. And so now this is the largest people group without a nation, and they live in 4 nations, in Turkey, Iran, Iraq, and Syria. And the guys in Iraq are pretty much autonomous. They're ticking off Baghdad. Actually, they just made a major sale of oil to, I think, to Russia. Iraq's not happy about that because they think it's theirs. Syria, they've established their own little country now that there's no really law in Syria. The Iran guys stay hidden in the mountain because we know Iran doesn't tolerate that kind of thing. And the guys in Turkey flare up every now and then, and that's where this guy was from. And when he was part of the PKK, he signed up to be a suicide bomber. He was part of an elite commando group that was going to do a massive operation to just terrorize the Turkish people. And he said he was sold out. He was ready to die for his country. And something weird happened. He went to a meeting and they were told, hey, we've decided we're going to be nonviolent now. We're going to try this whole political system thing. So no offense, if you want to leave, no harm, no foul. And they left. And so this guy's like, what do I do now? I was going to die for my country. Now I don't know what to do. I hadn't planned beyond this. And well, he had. So I'm ad-libbing, of course. He spoke in Turkish and was translated. Anyway, interesting guy. He had been picked up 3 times by the Turks for being a militant and had been imprisoned 3 times. And he said, well, I had managed to get a New Testament. And so every time I got put in prison, I read the whole New Testament. And he read the New Testament 3 times. Yeah, it is. But it still wasn't clicking. But he said something very interesting. He said, if you go into the mountains of Kurdistan, you will find crosses in the mountains made of rocks. Because these guys venerate Jesus and think he's a great example of moral life. And they've said that when they have their own country, they will establish it based on the principles of this Jesus guy. And not really knowing, but they just think he's swell. So he's read the New Testament 3 times. He was going to kill himself. He doesn't want to go back to Islam. He's very disillusioned. And so he decided one day, I want to know more about this Jesus guy. Let's find out what's going on there. You know, I've read all about him, but I don't get it. So he didn't want to ask anybody, hey, do you know where the church in town is? That wasn't going to go over well. So he walked the city for 3 days, and he couldn't find a church. And then he decided, well, I'll walk the city walls and see if I see something from above. And he finally spotted a cross. And he says, oh, okay. So he goes to this church. And it's a Orthodox Syriac church, Eastern Orthodox. Excuse me. And he walks in, and he finds the priest, and he says, I have questions. And this is why this guy's story touched me. The priest says, I can't answer your questions. I don't have time for you. Would you please leave? And of course, I wanted to slap the priest. Dude, this guy just walked into your church, said, I have questions. And he left. And he got home, and this is what he said. I'm going to try again next week. Yeah. I would have been ticked. Yeah, he was determined. That's right. The next Sunday, he went back to that church. Same church. Well, he didn't know where else to go. He's about to walk in when he realized something across the street. And he sees a sign that says, Evangelical Church, in his language. And so he went and knocked on the door, and he said, I have questions. And they said, come on in. And he's now a believer. He's married. He sorted out some troubles with the government because he had been a draft dodger. And they said, dude, you got to make that right. And he said, okay. So he did his time. And because he's a member of the PKK, or he was, this came up when he got to border control in Israel. And said, no, dude, you're registered as a terrorist. You can't come into Israel. And they let him in. Yeah, they let him in. So just amazing testimonies. Oh, I think I skipped one. No. This is Reverend Andrew White. Yes, Andrew White. He's called the Vicar of Baghdad. He spoke at the conference. I had heard a lot about him. It was interesting to see him in the flesh. He is really tall. He is really tall. He is a total nerd, as you can tell by the bow tie. He is, though. I wish you'd heard him talk. He's British, and he wears a bow tie, so... And the dude has got like a whole theological library memorized. So he's an amazing man. What's even more amazing to me is that he suffers from multiple sclerosis. And yet there he is in Baghdad. His church is just outside the green zone. And he told us how the church has been decimated by persecution. And yet they persevere. And the Lord manifests himself in amazing miracles, including resurrections, none of which he's attended, by the way. The Lord says, I'm never there, it's always a child. And then they come running to me and says, Abuna, Abuna, which is Father, this happened. And then he goes and verifies. And the other thing that struck me is with all the persecution in Baghdad, he asked some of the people who have the means to leave, he said, why do you stay? And they said, we're waiting for that Isaiah 19 highway you told us about. And so it's just amazing faith in the tiny body in Baghdad. This guy said he doesn't think he could live in London anymore. It'd be too boring. Can you imagine? And I imagine it would be. He's lived in Baghdad for years. He's got several books out. I haven't read them, but I recommend you look them up, and he tells the testimonies of what's happened there in Baghdad. Andrew White. I think it's listed at the end of the notes. Maybe I didn't list it at the end of the notes. Okay, 2 more testimonies. This is Ali Pektas. And this guy really blessed me because I had heard first, oh, the dude from the movies here, and I was like, I had no idea what they were talking about. And then on the 3rd day of the conference at lunch, we took them all on a quick mini tour of Jerusalem, or I should say the rector of Christ Church did. And I got to go along and photograph the whole thing. And at the end, when we're walking back into the old city, a small group of them come up to me. He doesn't speak English. And he gets his translator to ask me, hey, he tells me, thank you so much for taking pictures. You know, you've been a real blessing. How can I pray for you? So I told him, and he says, can you give me something to remember? So I gave him one of my business cards. Well, lo and behold, he was the speaker that night. And I about passed out. And what they were talking about is there's a series called More Than Dreams. This is Pastor Ali. This is the guy who got saved in Mecca. And he told us his testimony. And he is such a cheerful guy, as you could tell from that picture. And if you hear his testimony, He was kind of an irreligious Muslim. He was an alcoholic. He abused his wife and his kids. But he hated himself for it, to the point that he actually moved to Istanbul to work and send the money home because he hated who he was at home. And one day one of his friends said, why don't you go on Hajj to Mecca? It's the yearly pilgrimage to Mecca. Allah will help you get rid of your drinking problem and fix your family. Why don't you go on Hajj? And so he decided to go on Hajj. And he went, and he's there with his friends. They're all sleeping in the tents. I don't know if you've seen the pictures. They're all in tents around the main, where the stone is that they march around. The fortress and stronghold. Anyway, he's sleeping there, and he dreams that Jesus is standing right there. And he says, Ali, I want you to leave this place. You're mine. And he wakes up and he knows it's Jesus. So he wakes up his buddies. He says, Jesus just showed up to me in a dream. Isa, I imagine he said, Isa just showed up to me in a dream. And they're like, dude, go back to sleep. And he tries, but he can't. The image is burned in his mind. And he keeps hearing, you are mine, leave this place. And he tells them again, no, Isa is talking to me. And he showed up in a dream. And his friend tells him, what would Jesus be doing here? This is the fortress of Muhammad and of Allah. And he tries to get back to sleep, and he can't. And finally in the morning he tells the guys, I can't go with you. And he goes all the way back to Turkey and tells this to his family. He gets all his neighbors and tells them what happened. And they all laugh at him, of course. But his wife says, this Jesus guy must be for reals, because you are not the same man that left. That's right. You're not the same man that left here. And what got me about his story is for 2 years, they didn't know any other believers. They didn't find anything. He didn't have a Bible for 2 years. And then finally one day he came from work, and he was trying to tune in a radio station, and he ran across a radio broadcast, Christian radio broadcast. And at the end they said, if you would like a Bible, write to this address. And he now pastors this church in Diyarbakir. And if you Google him, he's connected with churches all over Turkey. Amazing guy. At the bottom of your notes, you can see how to find the movie. It's on Netflix and Amazon and also YouTube and Vimeo. Last guy, this guy is very important. His name is Tas Sada. He's got boldness for the Lord, because he came into this conference and the first thing he did is scold everybody. And it was a needed message. We had come here for this thing of unity, and he was reminding that we had to have unity in the body between Jew and Muslim and Gentile believer. And what had happened is just about a month or two before had been this conference in Bethlehem called Christ at the Checkpoint. And it was basically a replacement theology conference and pro-Palestinian, give the Palestinians the land conference. And so it had created a lot of division among the believers in the land. So he went in to scold everybody about the infighting that had begun. But then he told his testimony. This guy used to be a sniper for Fatah, for the PLO. And then he became Arafat's chauffeur. And he was very restless, he said, and was causing problems in his family. And his family said, you need to go away and get a life. So he decided, I'll go to the United States, I'll woo some lady, get myself citizenship, and then see ya. And that was his plan. So he gets over here, and he was working at a restaurant, and later it turns out that the restaurant he worked at was in a predominantly Jewish neighborhood. And what's interesting is, and I do recommend you hear him tell his version or read the book. We'll talk about the book in a little bit. He was a busboy. He had just gotten to the States, and he was working as a busboy. And he went to clear this guy's table. And the guy said, "Thank you." And it floored him. He'd never been thanked for a menial task like that in his life. And he said, "Why did you thank me?" He goes, "Because you're clearing my table." And it just really stuck with him. And he ends up forging a 17-year friendship with this man who decides to take him under his wing. And he goes from busboy to waiter to host to working in the back to now he's managing a restaurant. And this friend, whose name I can't remember right now, I think it's Charlie. But anyway, this friend is helping him to set up another restaurant, and they're looking for properties. And one of the properties, he calls him and says, "Hey, have you seen the property on the corner of such and such? I think it'd be great for the restaurant." And Toss says, "Oh, no, that used to be a funeral home. It gives me the heebie-jeebies. No." And his friend tells him, he laughs. He says, "You know what your problem is, Toss? You don't have the fear of God." Well, this ticked him off. Because I'm a Muslim. Who doesn't fear God? You know what? And he's like, "How can you say that? You know who I am," and all of this. He's all offended. But then he asks him, "What about you? How come you're so at peace?" And he just tells him, "I know somebody." He doesn't say anything. This is 17 years into the friendship. Now that's just bugging him. I know somebody. It's really bugging him. So he calls him. He goes, I need you to tell me. Oh, let's have dinner. Okay, so they get together for dinner. And it's driving him nuts. So much to the point that he said that he's so desperate. He said, "You need to tell me who you know," that he got down on his knees at the restaurant. He goes, "Everybody probably thought I was proposing." And the dude's like, "Get up, man." "Not here. You know what? Let's just have dinner. I'll tell you tomorrow. This is not the place to do this." Okay. And you can find this testimony on YouTube and verify me. And so he goes to his house, and he's really going crazy at this point. He goes, "Are you going to tell me?" And they're walking in the door. And he says, "Okay, I'll tell you." He says, "In order to have peace, you have to love a Jew." He goes ballistic. "What do you mean? You've already offended me yesterday with the whole fear of God thing. Now you're telling me I have to love a Jew. And you know me for 17 years. You know my history. You know everything." And he's like, "Come inside the house, and we'll talk about it." So they go into the house, and he's really upset at this point. And his friend goes and gets a Bible. And they're sitting on the couch, and he said that his friend put the Bible in between them on the couch so that it was kind of like coming at him. You know how things move? And then he jumped. He says, "What are you doing? Why?" "That's the word of God. I can't touch it." And he goes, "I don't know why I said that. I was a Muslim. We don't think that this is the word of God, but that's what he said." He's like, "Get away from me." He says, "Okay, you think that's the word of God?" He says, "Yes." And he says, "Okay, let me read you something." And he reads them John 1. "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." And he said, that's all he heard. He blacked out. When he comes back to, he's on his knees with his hands up. And he's praying in tongues. And he goes, "But now I'm worried because I look at my friend and he's ashen, like he's seen a ghost." So he goes, "I'm worried about my friend." He goes, "What happened? What's wrong?" And he said, "Well, when I was reading you levitated off the couch and you were fighting, and then you came down on your knees praising God. And that's how Toss got saved. I'm sure it's in his book, but you can hear him tell it various times on YouTube. So I'm going to recommend 3 books here for those of you who want to continue on this topic. Toss's is the first one. Once an Arafat Man. PLO Sniper. And by the way, Toss lives in Jericho, and there is a price on his head. And he worships at a Messianic congregation in Jerusalem. And he said, I know that they're out to kill me, but he says, I don't look behind me like I used to. When God says it's time for that bullet, it comes. But until then, I have no fear. And he lives in Jericho, and he runs a ministry called Seeds of Hope. And that's a whole other testimony I won't get into because it's getting late. I imagine it's in the book. So Once an Arafat Man by Tas Sada. Again, I haven't read this one, but I've heard him give his testimony live and then watched other versions of it. So, Son of Hamas by Mossab Hassan Youssef. This one I have read. It's a tough read if you haven't read it, but I think it's twofold. One, it shows us how God is moving among the Muslims in the West Bank. His father is one of the founders of Hamas, and he has been disowned by his father, officially anyway. He worked as a double agent for Israel, and that's why he's been disowned by his father, aside from becoming a believer in the end. But it's also a good story because it reminds us that Israel is human and they make mistakes. Because, one, it's hard to handle what do you do when you don't know who's a terrorist and who isn't. And 2, what do you do with that anger? You know, and we do see abuse. He does chronicle some abuse from the IDF and from the police. But at the same time, he ends up helping Israel, and he believes it's a just cause. Good story. And then this one, God's Tsunami. And the reason I put this one here is because it is a fascinating overview of Christian history. And the long and short of it is, the Lord told Paul to move west, and he did, and the gospel has continued west, and it continues to move west. And right now we know China, the church in China has been rising for the last 50 years, even under persecution. India, the church in India is growing. And the point is that the church in Asia is about to evangelize the Muslim nations. And we're here in the home stretch. And who will make the Jews more jealous than a saved former Muslim? That's who's going to ultimately make them jealous to the nth degree. And so this is about how the gospel has been moving west and is about to really, the tip of the wave is hitting the Muslim nations right now. The one thing that struck me from what this guy said is the church in China has been growing under persecution because they're growing without fear. And they won't have fear of persecution, so they will go. You have to have no fear to go evangelize the Muslims, especially the radical ones. And so just I think, encouraging story of where we are in the prophetic timeline. The writer's an interesting guy. He's a Japanese-American married to a New York Jew, and they're both naturalized Israelis now. So they pastor a church up in Mount Carmel. And that's me. That's my website. I monitor the news for headlines that I think are important to intercessors, and I post other stories by other leaders, Rick Ridings particularly, but also other leaders in Israel. Let's close in prayer. Father, I just thank you so much for this time of fellowship, Lord, and for you teaching us your heart for all the peoples of the earth. Lord, if anything I said was not of you, may it just fall to the ground. But anything that is of you, you said your word will not return void and that it will go out and produce fruit. So I just thank you. I thank you for JHOP, Lord, and their perseverance here in this city as a watchman at the South Gate. I thank you for all the intercessors in El Paso who facelessly and namelessly are watchmen on the wall here for you, Lord. I just thank you that you fortify them and give them ear to hear and boldness to speak. B'Shem Yeshua, amen.